One of the big changes with ASP.NET Core is that how applications start up is quite different. The downside is that it's something new to learn. But the really good news is that it's really well designed, transparent, and pretty easy to use once you understand all that's happening. Keep in mind that an ASP.NET Core app is a console application, and one of the things you need to do there is to call the useStartup method on the Web Host Builder object using a startup class, which by convention is named Startup. Pretty clever, huh? Okay, so ASP.NET Core apps require a startup class, at least one. This class is responsible for configuring the request pipeline that handles all requests that come into the application. Now you can have multiple startup classes, but the runtime has some rules for picking the one to use. And you can have different startups for different environments. So the way it works is that you can specify a different assembly to search using the hosting application configuration key. The class itself doesn't have to be public. If there are multiple startup classes, ASP.NET looks for one in the project's root namespace. Otherwise, it chooses one in the alphabetically first namespace. So it's a slightly random based on your namespace names. And then you can define separate startup classes for different environments, and the appropriate one will be selected at runtime. So you have a lot of flexibility, but you just need to exercise a bit of care to get everything configured right. Now the setup class constructor can accept dependencies that are provided through dependency injection. And I'll talk more about what dependency injection is a little bit later in the course. But briefly, in order to make services available in startup, you add the appropriate interface as a parameter in one of three places. You can provide it as a parameter to the startup class's constructor. You can provide a parameter to the configure method, or you can provide a parameter to the configure services method. And I'll talk about those when we look at the code again, and more deeply when we look at dependency injection. All right, now you have to include a configure method, and you can have an optional configure services method. So these are the two methods that the runtime calls when the application starts. And as you'll see shortly, this is where you pull services into the application and then define the pipeline using middleware that determines how a request is going to be processed. And this is really cool because you can control the order in which a request is handled by various services. So let's talk a little bit more about those two methods. The first is the configure services method, and the runtime calls this first. But it's optional, so it's called first, obviously, if it's there. So this is the method that adds features to the application. As a practical matter, it's going to be a rare, non-trivial application where you'll want to leave this method out, if that's really even possible. You can certainly do it in trivial hello world kind of applications, but any application that's going to really use ASP.NET Core services like Entity Framework and various other services, you're going to need to include a configure services method. So just deal with it. All right, so this method takes an iService collection parameter and then optionally returns an iService provider. Now, the code produced by the standard code template within Visual Studio doesn't include that return value, but you can if you need to access the services from elsewhere. Now, the configure services method is called before configure because you have to add some features before they can be wired up to the request pipeline within the configure method. Now, within this method, for any features that require substantial setup, there are add something methods. Those are extension methods, so they start with add and then they have some other thing that they're adding. And these are methods on iService collection, that object that is injected into the configure services method. And again, I'll talk more about those shortly, because there are various ways to add services. And this is also how you wire up your own custom objects to use with dependency injection. So just store that away for the time being. Okay, and then you can also add different configuration option classes in this method as well. Then the second method is the configure method. And this is required, and it's called second if there's a configure services method. So you use this method in order to specify how the ASP.NET Core application is going to respond to HTTP requests. And essentially what it's doing is it's defining the request pipeline. And that's configured by adding middleware components to an iApplication Builder instance that is again provided by dependency injection to the method as a parameter to the method. And then you have a set of use methods generally. There's actually some additional ones, and we'll talk about those, but most of the time they're use methods. So use something is the name of the method. And these again are extension methods, and they add a middleware component to the request pipeline. And that just means that you're adding a class or some kind of code that is going to handle or respond or process an HTTP request as it moves through the pipeline. So, for instance, the useIdentity extension method adds authentication middleware to the request pipeline. And there's various other extension methods that you can use, and we'll look at several of them when we dig down into the code.